Well, thanks everyone for coming. My name is Paul Spears, and you're here for the Advanced Angular Lunch. This is hosted by the folks at Oasis Digital, so thank you for having me. Let me speak. And today I'm going to be talking about the dangerous temptation of customizing Angular material. So this talk was actually kind of meant from the perspective of kind of talking to my fellow consultants at our organization. But as I started fleshing out what I wanted to say to them, I realized that there's actually a great general purpose talk in here as well. And so I opened it up to be more of a, hey, let's just talk to the community about the idea of customizing Angular material. And in particular, I'm talking about the idea of using CSS in particular to change the look and feel of Angular material. We'll get more into the specifics of that and what I'm more specifically what I'm not talking about in just a little bit. But this is coming from a very real place. Now, as a consultant at Oasis Digital, I talk to lots of different clients, and I've found a surprising trend of client after client after client coming to us that has walked down the path I'm going to talk us through, or a very similar path to it, and realized, hey, there's a real need that's cropping up, a real pattern that's cropping up, and it would be nice to kind of capture what I know about it, what I've done about it in the past, and kind of bring this to the fore so that way folks can know what they might stumble into if they were to go down this route themselves. So with that said, again, I'm Paul Spears. I work here at Oasis Digital. At Oasis, we do custom software development, consulting, training for folks, most often in the Angular space, but with web software in general. And of course, you can find me there on Twitter. So the idea is, again, I'm going to talk about how we got here, like this idea of customizing Angular material with CSS. On the surface, it just sounds like well, why would you do that kind of idea? And we're going to talk through some legitimate use cases and situations that people find themselves in that kind of lead us towards the right answer for that situation being to, in fact, customize Angular material. And then we're going to take a look at some of the challenges, in particular, the challenges that Angular material that is unique to Angular material when it comes to providing these custom appearances. And then interestingly enough, we're going to talk about Sass. We're going to talk about some tips and tricks with Sass. So that way, once you've kind of resigned yourself to, yes, I'm in a hard spot, I've got some hard work in front of me, I want to equip us with some tools that we can use to at least mitigate some of that difficulty. And then at the end, I'm going to give everyone a unique opportunity, and we'll see what that's about later. Okay, as promised, I want to talk about real quick what this talk's not about. And to do that, I'm just going to acknowledge the fact, once again, that naming is hard. So what this talk is not about, this isn't about theming. So Angular material, it supports the idea of being able to theme your applications, meaning that you can change the color or the typography of your app, as well as like per component. They give you the tools to do that. That's all in the box. That's all pretty well supported. That's not exactly what we're talking about here. Also, the CDK, it's a companion of the Angular material library. Angular material itself is actually built on top of it. And we're not talking about building custom components with that. What we're talking about very specifically is I've built my app and turns out the client doesn't like the way it looks. So what is the easiest, fastest way to continue to deliver the value I've already built while minimizing the impact to the code base itself? So that said, let's talk again about how did we get here. And so I want to paint a picture. I want to walk you through the scenario that I described earlier that I see clients walk into time and time again. And it starts off with you're an architect on a team, and you've been tasked with creating the architecture for a new project for a new client. And you have a team that consists of managers, developers, and designers. And as you're working on the architecture for this project, within the particular niche of talking about the front-end visual layer, you're discussing all of the trade-offs for the various kinds of frameworks, design systems out there, and you really want to write down and capture what each of these stakeholders in this process are looking for whenever they're trying to build out that very front of the front-end view layer. And in particular, the managers, they're most interested in making sure it's something that you can iterate and develop with quickly. It's easy to develop and scale with. And at the end of the day, the manager's concern is that they want to make the customer happy. The developers, they prefer things that have nice APIs and abstractions. They want it to be something that they can plug in and easily manipulate, easily change. They want it to be well documented. They want it to be something that ideally they could go out and say, hey, I'm just going to go grab this third-party library, or I'm going to go ahead and pay a little bit of money to use an existing design system that has an Angular language level adapter for it. That way I don't have to build all that from scratch. And of course, this is a high-class firm here, so the developers, they're also directly concerned with the satisfaction of the customer themselves. And then we have the designers on the team, and they're not too particularly concerned about that it has to be some sort of custom bespoke design. Instead, they're most concerned that whatever design system that they have in place, it can be manipulated so that it can be accessible, that it's usable, and that the design language itself is consistent. And of course, the designers, they too are most concerned about what makes the customer happy. So given all of these bullet points, on the surface, Angular Material looks like a great fit. It actually hits these all fairly well. And so you make that decision. You say, all right, let's use Angular Material. I've used it in the past. I got great results. Let's give it a shot. And so you go about creating an initial demo, and you work on it for several months, and then you come back and you're ready to actually demo to the client some of the proof of concepts and the initial ideas that you've got working. Clients thrilled with the functionality. They love how fast you're moving. Only problem is they aren't happy with the look. And so all of these other points start to go away, because one consistent theme that all of the team members are interested in capturing is that they want to make the customer happy. So at this point, we have a couple of options. We can either try to convince the customer that this design is going to work, that it's going to work well for them and their users, or we can change the visual design. There's just one problem though, and that problem is that doesn't actually work. You can't actually convince them of something when they have a subjective gut reaction to the aesthetics of the product. So one of the very first studies that was done in the space of software development with usability and crossing that with the aesthetic aspects of the application, the takeaway from that study was this sentence here, that the apparent usability is strongly affected by the aesthetic aspects rather than the inherent usability. Basically meaning that the way the user feels about the appearance affects how well they perceive the app to work, or the feature, or the screen that they're working with. They have it directly tied in their minds that their perception of its usability, how well it looks, is actually how well the app can perform. And so we're fighting against psychology here at this point to try and convince the client that the way they feel about the appearance of Angular Material is not necessarily warranted. And no amount of Google usability studies is going to tell them that they have bad taste. So with that known and with that understood, that kind of leaves us in a rough spot where if we're going to make this client happy, we're going to have to do something about the visual appearance. So what do we do? What do we do about this problem? Let's start with some assumptions. So as I said earlier, your team has already been going down the path of making this app work. It has real usability, real features. There's been a real time investment already made. And you're starting to wonder whether or not this is going to be like a sunk cost situation where you just need to scrap it or not. Your design team, they're going to get to work right away. They're going to be working with the client to start extracting the actual design specifications that they'd actually like out of them. And that's going to take some time. You don't know how much, you just know it's going to take time. Also, another assumption is you have developers waiting. While you're trying to figure out the path to take, You have a team of developers that have been working on the prototype that are going to continue to work on the product itself. And if you pause development, you know that those developers, those are going to be redirected to other efforts. It's going to cause context switching. It's going to be difficult to get them back. You may not be able to get them back. You may end up with a different development team when it comes time to start working again. And so if you don't put them to work, you're going to risk losing that effort. And then, of course, budget and delivery, that's still being stressed from management. You still have all of the pressure, and any kind of stall or decline in momentum, that's going to be seen as putting the project at risk. So you have all of these real world constraints that are coming together. So what are our options? The first is start over from scratch. Toss out what you've done and start from scratch. That has the benefit that we're able to now move in whatever direction is necessary. We don't have to worry about what we've built before. So that gives us a lot of freedom. It's potentially very costly. It was very risky to throw out all that progress, especially for the upper management, who again is most focused on the budget and the deadlines. They're looking at this and saying, how can you possibly start over with the investment we've made already? Another option is that we could pause development and convert design systems. Take our current effort and focus entirely on moving to a new design system. The problem with this approach is that we don't know what the client actually wants. We don't know what our target is yet. And so it's very easy that we could then pivot to something that is equally ill-equipped for the kind of visual design that the user wants until we know what they want. Another option is that we can simply pause development until design is ready. But as we already mentioned, we've got developers waiting to do some work here. That's going to cause us to face the risk of those developers being moved off to another effort. It also has the problem of it's got bad optics for upper management that development would pause until that design is ready. And so the last obvious option here is that we can just keep going. We just keep working on the features with the design framework that we have, and we'll figure it out at the end whenever we actually have a design spec ready. Now, exploring these answers and actually figuring out what is the best right one is highly contextual and well out of scope for this talk. So we could have a whole nother series of talks about what the right path is here. But in this made up imaginary scenario, we don't really have a good way of knowing exactly what the right answer is. But we're going to assume for this client, for this development firm, for the aspects that we're facing, that the right answer is to keep going and figure it out at the end. And that's really kind of the first big point here, is to get everyone on board with realizing that this is a real world thing that comes up. It's not necessarily anyone's wrongdoing. These situations can just happen. And we're now tasked with figuring out the best way to move forward. So you set to work. You start developing on the app. You continue developing on the app using Angular material, and you're working through it as best you can. You finally get some design specs back. The design team's been hard at work trying their best to extract the actual needs and desires from the client. And it's not uncommon that it takes 6 months to get some initial good, stable design specs out of it. And you start looking at your Angular material app, you start looking at the design spec, you begin to pair them together, you start looking at modifying the CSS, and you realize very quickly that this is actually a very hard task. And so essentially, what is at this difficulty? Why is there such a gap between taking Angular material and applying a different appearance to it? Why is that so hard? Well, fundamentally, it's a no-no. Angular material is actually built on top of layers of abstractions and designs. And the whole point of Angular material is that it's going to encode for you an abstraction for the visual language for your application. It's not meant to be an API that allows you to easily modify the design, because it's supposed to be prescriptive of a design. The idea is that it was built on top of Google's material design specification, which was meant to provide a unified appearance to all of their properties. And they extended that and abstracted that in such a way that makes it easy for Angular developers to tap into that design and deliver applications faster. And towards that end, it does an amazing job. However, for the purposes of modification, the API simply isn't there. And when we look at that history, we can see again how that Angular material implementation is actually built on these various layers, where the bottommost here is that material metaphor. It's the idea that it's a design specification built on the idea that we're going to use the physical world and the way we interact with physical materials within our applications. We're going to take that idea of a piece of paper sliding around, covering other pieces of paper, being folded, being stacked up on top of one another, and the way that creates visual depth. That's all a material. That's all a metaphor for how we could create a design system or design specification on top of it. And then from that, Google's material design spec was born. It's that middle layer right here, but it's completely agnostic of any one implementation. It's just an encoding of that metaphor in a way that can be used to describe applications. And then finally, the Angular material implementation itself that sits on top of that, that actually encodes that metaphor and that spec as an actual abstraction that we can consume. So when you understand that there's a fundamental characteristic to this that's preventing the modifications, we can kind of get on board with what the Angular material team is doing and just realize that it's just a unique technical challenge that is facing us. So that said, I want to take a quick aside and point out that this is not a failing of Angular material or the Angular team here. In fact, no two migrations are going to be the same, whether we are talking about moving from custom CSS to Bootstrap, or from Bootstrap to Material, or from Angular Material to Tailwind, or even Carbon to Clarity. All of these migrations are going to be different, and they're all going to have challenges. There's nothing unique about Angular Material other than the particular challenges that its path has. Every one of these migrations is going to have a path that you go down that will be full of challenges. And those challenges are all going to be different. So I just want to make it perfectly clear that this is in no way meant to be, a dig at the Angular material team. This is just the nature of these migrations. All of these design systems, all of these libraries, they all act as an abstract representation of a visual design. And if that abstraction isn't right for your client's needs, then you're going to have a challenge moving to a different abstraction. The same is true for modeling data in backend systems. If you pick the wrong abstraction, moving to the correct one is a path that's just going to take time to work through. All right, back onto the main path here though. With Angular material itself though, what are the challenges that are specific to migrating away from it? Excuse me. The common ones we have listed here, we're going to go into each of them, but we've got problems with structural conflict, CSS specificity, there's going to be functional gaps, and then even the version change of Angular material itself is going to be causing us some heartache. So let's dig right into the first one, structural conflicts. All right, so here we have a very simple design. On the left, we've got Angular materials pagination control that's used to control a table, how many rows are on that table, and which page of content are we looking at. And on the left is the one that Angular material ships in the box, and it's real easy to get on the page. The client, we're going to assume, for whatever reason, they would rather see the page size control, have that swapped positions with the actual number of items per page display. Don't know why they want that, but they want that. That sounds like a super easy fix. Anyone who doesn't have a deep technical understanding of Angular material, they would look at that and say, oh, that's super easy. I can knock that out with some CSS. But then you go to actually look at it, and you say, okay, so to create a map paginator, this is it. This is all the API for the layout that's provided to us. So there's not much here that we can actually get a hold of and use to manipulate. So that leaves us with needing to go in and actually manipulate the DOM that map paginator produces in order to change the layout. Only problem is, this is the DOM that's rendered. We're not going to go into all of it. The key thing I want to point out, though, is that this entire div, that this outermost div, this is the container for our paginator. And then there are two elements. There's the one that's closed right here next to the first arrow. And there's this one right here next to it. This is a sibling of that first one that contains the rest of the content. This first div right here that we have the arrow next to, this one actually represents that page size control. All the visual elements for that are here inside of it. And then within the next one, this actually groups together the buttons that allow you to change pages, as well as the visual display that tells you what page you're on. So the challenge here is that if you look at it, this visual element and this visual element, they're not actually siblings. There's like an aunt or uncle relationship between the two, if you will, where the actual page size selector is not a sibling. And so for the purposes of layout and the way that a browser is going to flow the content, you have to basically fight against it in order to actually get these two things to swap position. That, if you know a little bit of CSS, isn't that difficult until you start taking into consideration things like the ability to resize and have it reflow in a responsive way. You can get this to work, but this is going to be a surprising struggle when all you want to do is swap the position of two elements on the page. So this is an example of where structural conflicts can really sneak in and eat away at your budget. Next up, we're going to talk about the deep CSS selector issue, and we're going to use our friend the map form field label for this. In particular, we're referring to the words outline form field. That's a label that is associated with this map form field. And let's just say we wanted to change the color that turns when there's an error. Angular material, it already does that. It uses the theme color. It'll change it red. But let's say we want to change it from red to orange. The client needs it to be a different color for whatever reason. And they need to change the color in a way that is inconsistent with the theming capabilities of the application. So here's the problem that's standing in the way of that. If we look at this, these are all of the selectors, if we start from the top and work our way down, that are between you and your destination of the label itself. So we have the label here down at the bottom, but that is deeply nested within this map form field. And we don't need to understand all of these classes, but just know that all of these classes and the structure itself all work together to create the surface area of the kind of the CSS rules that might come in play whenever you try and style that label. In particular, this right here is what you get when you are using one of the themes from Angular material. This is the selector that is used to color it red whenever there's an error. So as you go to write your own rules, you're going to have to understand the entire deep structure in order to write selectors that are specific enough to target what you're actually after. Now, this particular example, it says that we're only technically using this portion of the selector. So that's the only piece that you would need to be more specific than. However, it still creates a lot of opportunity for mistakes as you're building out your CSS. All right, the next bit that's going to be a challenge are functional gaps. So here we have on the left, this is what Angular material provides when you're looking at a date picker. Simple little input with an icon. You click the icon, the selector appears. However, the client wants something more like what you have on the right, which is actually a date time picker. They want the ability to just say, I would like to select not only the day, but the time. I want to be able to do that just in one shot. Again, from a design and aesthetics perspective, this seems like a relatively small change. But when it comes time to actually work on this within Angular material, they don't even have a way to bring this stuff together. You're going to be writing completely custom code to make this work. It's beyond just structural adjustments. It's beyond CSS adjustments. You're going to have to write your own custom control to bring this functionality together. And then at that point, style it to look like the rest of your Angular controls. So this is another big gap when we're just trying to modify what we already have in place. Last step here on understanding some of these difficulties and challenges is version uncertainty. And so for this one, I'm going to go back to our label color, and all of these selectors right here, like these were never meant for you and I. Like this list of classes and the selectors used to target these elements, again, this was meant for like an internal API that Google uses to encode that abstraction. And it's not meant for us to necessarily dig into, try and latch onto and attach business logic to. So as we do so, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be putting ourselves at risk. And the thing that we're putting ourselves at risk for is that as Angular material moves from version to version, they are completely free to change the definition of and the way these classes are implemented and how they affect the application. And they can do that without even calling them a breaking change because it's not part of a public API. So as you go about trying to work on top of this, just know that this could change underneath you. Pardon me. All right, so those are the challenges. Let's look at something a little more concrete. So for this, we have our friend, the mat input. This is a material form field with a mat input inside of it. And we're going to assume that on the left, this is what you get out of the box when you use Angular material. And then on the right, we have what the client actually wants. So there's a couple of properties that are changing here. We obviously have like a more bold black form field label here. The background color's changed. We have the position of the label itself has changed. So just a couple of properties. In particular, yes, the active input label position, label color, its font weight, and then the background color. Those are the properties that have changed. Now, the act of actually writing the CSS to target and change them, it is a long, tedious process of inspecting the browser DOM, inspecting the elements, understanding how those elements relate, and then writing the CSS. We don't have time to go through that exercise here. But as you work through it for the first time, understanding the relationships and writing the CSS, this is what you'd write to achieve the look that we were going for. So just to break it down real quick, we would attach to the mat form field class. This is the element that contains all of the pieces that we might want to modify. And we'll start with this middle one here, and then we'd have a subclass within it called mat form field outline. And this represents the box that contains just the portion of our control whose background color we want to change. So then we attach a light gray to that. And then in addition to a mat form field, if a mat form field can float and should float, meaning that our label has been moved to that upper position, well, if that's the situation, any label contained within it should have a font weight bold, be colored black, and be positioned accordingly. So there's our four properties: our background color, our font weight, the color of the label itself, and the label's position. There's one more tweak that you just have to learn by way of actually going through this exercise. I'm going to go back a second here on the slide. And that is, as you move the outline, the gap that appears here in our outline, that's actually a different element that's fixed, and you have to manually close that gap. And that's what this line right here is doing. So not too terrible. If you're just trying to understand and discover this for yourself, there's actually many hours of work to understand and write this code. But once you've written it, no big deal. Now I'm going to break from the tradition of having a dry code base here. I'm going to change this just a little bit. I'm going to take this line right here, the one that has the can float, should float, and I'm going to split it up. Because what I'd like to be able to do is, as I account for changes in the future, what I'd like to be able to do is identify and individually mark which aspects of our label we're modifying. So here, even though these selectors are exactly the same, I'm going to split them out. And why I do that will be more clear here in a moment. Because now we're moving on to the next phase of our conversation. And that I've actually tricked you all, and I've now gotten you all to attend a Sass for Angular developers talk. I know a lot of team members and a lot of people that I work with, they kind of think about Sass as an afterthought or a secondhand citizen of an Angular application. But your CSS is actually like 1/3 of your Angular application. And knowing Sass will actually give you a whole lot of tools for tackling things. And so I'm going to go into some of the tricks that Sass gives us. We'll apply it to this sample that we're working on, and we'll see what happens to the code base. All right, the first one, most folks know this one. This one's pretty easy, low-hanging fruit, and that's the idea of the Sass variable. It's the notion that within a Sass file, you can specify with a $sign the name of a variable, and then you can specify a value that you might use in some particular rule following it. And then to use it, you simply use that variable name with the $sign as if it were a value. So pretty easy, low-hanging fruit here. But let's take a look now at what it looks like to apply that to that example. And for that, I'm going to head into StackBlitz to demo that, just because it gives us a little more freedom to move around and explore the code. And so this is the exact same example that we had. We have the outline here is the outline form field label is moved up. It's bolder, it's black, and our background is gray. So we're still dealing with the same thing, but now we've identified some Sass variables to store the light gray color, the black label color, the bold aspect of it, as well as these font positions. And it gives us a way of naming things, which is always helpful when trying to maintain some potentially difficult code, and especially if that code is going to undergo some change as the end user changes their mind on the design. So what that does is that makes it so that inside our actual rules, for the rules that we're applying, we're able to then substitute out the names of the variables. So that's pretty straightforward. Let's take a look at another trick. This one is the mix-in. So mix-ins are magic. It's basically a way of adding a function to your CSS. And in this example, we have a mix-in named square. And that square mix-in accepts a parameter of size and radius. And then you can use those variables as if they were values. But if you look at the body of the mix-in, all it does here is it specifies these various properties that it's going to set, the width and the height in particular. And it also shows conditionally adding a border radius. But there's no selectors inside of here. The idea is that you can apply these properties at the point of use, regardless of a particular containing selector. We see that down here where it's used with this class called avatar. We can include our mix-in, and that's going to apply these properties parameterized in this way. If you get nothing else out of this talk, just knowing about and using mix-ins, if you have to write CSS, is just going to be a huge win. Take the time to look up and learn some mix-ins. In particular, let's see what happens to our code when we apply this idea. All right, so same example once again, but now we have some mix-ins. If we collapse the code a little bit, we actually can see that I've got a mix-in called form field floating label position. It takes a top and a left. A mix-in for the form field background color, floating label weight, and the floating the form field label color. And what's really nice is that once you have these mix-ins, this is what it looks like now to modify our material form field. We simply include whichever aspects that we'd like to modify, and we say how we'd like to modify it. The implementer of modifying the mat form field doesn't actually have to care about the inner workings of what it means to modify the form field background color. They just say, I would like to modify the form background color, please. Now, of course, someone still has to write the mix-in, but you have a separation of concern. So I know our audience members typically like to hear those kinds of words, things like separation of concern, because that really speaks to the kind of architectural patterns that they're used to inside of building Angular applications and architecting out things like their state management within GRX or a smart view component pair. They like the idea of separation of concerns, and mix-ins are a great way to add that now to our design layer. So we're basically preparing ourselves for the inevitable future where, as the design process continues to adjust, as the needs of the client continue to be understood better, and we get that feedback, we're able to use these mix-ins to isolate away the actual implementation of Angular material away from our desire to manipulate it. So that's a huge win. The definition of these is pretty simple. In addition to simply the properties, you can also specify further selectors. So here inside my mix-in, we're saying whenever someone includes this, add a sub-selector of mat form field outline and give it a background color based on the parameterized color. All right. Next up is Sass module loading. We've got modules in TypeScript. We can put content in different files and sling it around. Well, why not Sass? Why not CSS? So for this example here, we have a file called _corners.scss where we've defined a radius and a mixin. And then within our button class, in a different file, we're using that corners module, and then we're including that mixin as needed. So not only do we have our separation of concerns, we can organize those separate pieces and put them in files as needed to do the job. So now when we go back, view this in our code base one more time, here we go. We click, still working the same way, still the same appearance, but now inside of our styles SCSS, as we look at the mat form field, we can see that we're including the various mix-ins just as we were before, but now they're not defined in the same file. Here, unfortunately, I did have to use a slightly different, older syntax for Sass modules because Stackblitz doesn't yet support @use. But same idea, you can import this content from this custom mat SCSS file, and then that gives you access to the mix-ins that are inside of it. And at this point, the mix-ins, they didn't change, but they are isolated off to the side. So we're able to, again, further separate out the details of what it means to modify these particular aspects of appearance, keep that separate from the actual declarative list here that says, here's what I would like to do. All right, one more trick. And this one's, in my opinion, the most controversial. The idea with showing you these tricks is not that you have to use all of them. It is, here's a collection of tricks. Use them as they make sense for you and your team. And this one's definitely the most controversial, but it adds a really unique spin to this idea of separation of concerns, and that is Sass interpolation. This is the idea that if you have a variable that contains a string, you can actually use that string value as part of an identifier for things like the property name. So for example, I have the variable here called $name, and by putting a pound curly around $name, it says take whatever value is stored in there and use it as part of the selector name right here with this .icon dash. Of course, you could use it as the entire property name. You could use it as part of a value. You can kind of drop this in anywhere you want, and it takes whatever is stored in that variable and just uses it right there wherever you apply it. Now, at first, that doesn't sound too helpful, but let's just take a look at how I utilize it here. All right, so once again, we have StackBlitz, we have our app, it's up and working. This one actually might be a little broken. Color didn't change like it was supposed to. But let's just take a look at what we've got going on. And this is our style CSS where we have our list of mix-ins. And the key thing here is that I've changed the selector name. The selector name is now pound curly mat form field. Previously, it was .mat form field. I didn't like this. I had a real problem with it being the selector name of the class mat form field, because that meant that the author of styles SCSS, even though they got rid of all the nitty-gritty implementation details, they still had one tiny bit of implementation detail left in the name of the selector. They still needed to know that the container element from Angular material has a class called mat form field. I don't like that characteristic. And so with interpolation, here I was able to say, as part of the contract between this file and custom mat will give you an identifier called mat form field, and it's going to contain the selector you need to target your mat form field. You don't have to care about what it actually is structurally or what the CSS of it is. You can simply say, I've got a mat form field, and then go on to use your mix-ins by name. And now your implementation does not know or care about any of the inner workings of the Angular material form field. So that's what we were after. That's what we were trying to achieve, was just a nice way of managing it. We're hedging against version changes over time. We're hedging against the future changes of our client, knowing that they're going to change their mind on aspects of design as they see it implemented. We know the design is naturally going to evolve over time. We're hoping to try and create an abstraction of our own that we wish Angular material had for us. And so that was the goal here, was to create the abstraction we wish we had to be able to apply it to Angular material. Now, one more thing, and that is, if you're thinking, well, this seems like a lot for such a simple example, well, now that we've finished modifying that one control, now we get to go back and make sure it still works with the 19 other variations of the structural combination of mat form field after you add and or remove the hints, the use of a suffix included icon, what kind of appearance that the user might choose to apply to it, and all of the combinations thereof. And that's just for these 4 properties that we've highlighted. And it doesn't include just the infinite number of properties that you could think of to also further modify. And so as this starts to grow, these techniques for managing it will really, really start to come in handy. Ideally, it would be wonderful if we could just go out into the world and say, you know what, I'd love to use a library that just allows me to declaratively state, this is the way I want to modify Angular material. Well, this is where your unique opportunity comes into play. I'm not going to say I have a library. It is not that far along, but all the techniques and the patterns that you're seeing here today, you can find code on GitHub on the link on that previous page that will allow you to do this for mat form field today. So you're more than welcome to take advantage of that code that's sitting out there. But your opportunity is that you can also help build this. You can be some of the folks involved in making this an actual library that people can use today to achieve this. But it still needs some work. It's still pretty early days for it. It's a pattern that has fallen out again of our experience working with various clients. So I'd love it if folks can jump in there and help me do this rather than re-implementing it on every Angular material project in existence from scratch. So quick recap, and then we'll get some questions in here. What did we set out to do today? What did we learn? Well, we understand that material is a great way to deliver apps quickly, but we needed to account for the fact that visuals aren't always up to par for what the client's after. We showed how, in the case of Angular material, that our styling approach is actually tied pretty tightly to architectural design, architectural approaches as well. Due to real world constraints, the best answer is often suboptimal. And you just have to deal with these real world problems, and you have to do the thing you don't want to do. In this case, override Angular material. But if you're clever and you have some SCSS tricks, you can actually get a nice little abstraction there and get some help while doing that migration. So that's it. That's my talk. Any questions?
Hey, Paul, that was awesome. Is there any kind of benefit to maybe going looking at like another way, like maybe extending the material classes and providing your own template, or is it so tightly coupled that you'd be kind of shooting yourself in the foot with that, with the way it adds classes and stuff?
So you could certainly extend what's already there, but I think everything, pardon me, everything that we talked about here so far, I think everything that we've talked about so far kind of would still act as a base for any extension that you'd like to build, because you still have challenges like, what happens if the next version of Angular material completely changes the structure and the existing classes that you've extended out from under you. So I think that that's a great way to think about it in practice is, yeah, let's go ahead and make our own little component level abstraction on top of it. But there's a lot of cases where that doesn't work. For example, wrapping an Angular material table and still allowing generic table views is actually a pretty deep challenge. So one, you can't always do that with Angular material. That's a unique challenge to Angular material. And two, in a lot of cases, you're still going to need that base CSS collection of overrides.
Yeah, actually, I have a question about that same thing, Paul. Hi, it's Kyle. So I tried to do what what Nate said. I'm like, well, I just want to make my own component. I'm just going to copy their component and do a different template. And this is like 2 years ago. I was trying this, and the problem I found is like Angular material ships a set of collaborating components, but there's no way to substitute one out.
Exactly. Yeah.
One time I had to do this. I actually had to like basically copy paste 3 Angular material components to make a very small edit in the template of one. My question is like, was I doing it wrong? Is there some trick that I don't know to say, yeah, I mean, let it still say it wants this component, but just like use this template instead. Is there any way to do that?
I mean, yeah, there's always ways to do that. The question is how much friction are you going to have along the way? Like I have seen folks go down that path, and typically what I find is that the only reason that you would, in my opinion, that you should prefer that path is if you're trying to fight that structural challenge I mentioned at the beginning, where there's something about the structure of the way the template is already created in Angular material that you have a fundamental need to change that, add to it, delete something from it, and for whatever reason, you can't just target it with CSS. And at that point, you might start thinking about, okay, I'm just going to literally copy the code base for Angular material and modify it with my own template. Most of the time, with few exceptions, most of the time, Angular material doesn't have an API to say, use this template in its place. And so your options are pretty limited. Again, that goes back to the why is this so hard at the beginning. Other questions?
Is there any chance that the transition to the, I can't remember what it's called, but they're using, they're kind of wrapping the web components, the material web components. Mm-hmm. Is there any chance that that might make this a little easier? I don't know if you have any insight into that.
Yeah, so what Nathan's referring to is the Angular team is working on a completely different implementation of Angular material. Different version of Angular material that is built on top of a core set of components that the Google team is shipping, and it taps into this idea of, hey, we can still have our material design spec, but there are some aspects of design that can be parameterized and still not break away from our material metaphor. And so they've actually shipped the ability to do that in newer versions of the material design spec, but the Angular material team is still working on and has been working on for some time, updating Angular material to bring that functionality to us. Now, with all of the churn and the reprioritization and kind of the long lead time on issues and based on the roadmap, I can't afford to wait for that when I'm dealing with my clients. Like the clients, like they have needs that are already behind. They need that path where the most vital thing is that people have got to keep moving forward. And so I can't afford to wait for an API that's coming sometime. Ideally, it would solve the problems, and when it ships, I will gladly delete my repo and say, yeah, we should update a version of material and use that instead.
So Paul, if I understood right, you're saying that like when they do switch, it's called MDC, like material components for the web, but they're not web components. Critically, they're not
Right.
building on the web components. But I think if I understood your presentation right, in theory, if you have this like separate library where you've done the selector modification stuff, you should kind of like only have to like rethink that library when that
Right.
evolution happens. And you should in theory not have to modify any of your app level code. Is that the idea there?
That is the idea. That's kind of what the level of abstraction is going for, is that if that CSS disappeared, your app would still function. Your app would still look okay, maybe not as intended, but it would still have all the functional bits there. And Angular material could come along and break all of it, and the app would still be okay. So this is not about saying, hey, pick a better library. This is saying, like, based on real world constraints, like this is the horse we bet on and we're stuck with it. How do we best deal with the uncertainties that we know are coming? It's like I'm seeing the chat here now that I'm not sharing, and I'm seeing lots of folks like shouting out different recommendations of libraries. And I totally agree that like the actual answer is to work with a client at the very beginning to figure out what the right visual language needs to be and pick a library that matches that from day one. But in the real world, that isn't always a conversation that gets to be had. Yeah, and switching from Angular material to a different a different material-based component library actually didn't solve any of the problems of the visual design issue.
I think some of the features that you brought up about Sass are available in basic CSS now, as long as you don't have to support legacy browsers. Is there any temptation on new projects to not use Sass and instead just stick with basic CSS?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be ideal. I was again trying to aim for a more generic solution. Now, someone might be in fact dealing with an older browser, might be using other kinds of features, and so I knew for most folks they had the tools to compile Sass down in the box, and didn't, if they were on that older version, they could just use this just fine. I'm not sure about, I'm not a huge Sass guru. I'm not trying to claim to be, or CSS guru for that matter. And so, yeah, what features in particular? I know CSS imports are around, CSS variables, our custom properties are great. Are mixins a thing in CSS when I wasn't looking?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah, the mixins were really like the big winner here for providing us that separation of concerns. Other questions?
We've talked a little bit in the past about creating wrappers around any library for a project. That way, if they decide to go from, we like Bootstrap now or whatever, you can just like change your wrappers. And you had some objections to it, so I thought it'd be a good time to kind of bring that up, because it's kind of like a similar tangential thought.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan in general of creating a wrapper or an abstraction around my visual layer. And the reason for that is because all the different visual libraries and design systems they are themselves an abstraction for a visual language. And if you go to swap them out, you're not just changing some colors and some styles. You are changing the abstraction that you're using. And so the notion that you can create your own abstraction that properly encapsulates this, to me, is not really a thing. Like in practice, I've seen lots of folks do it, and I've seen moderate degrees of success with it. But at the end of the day, like Angular Material is a great example of it. Like if you want to wrap their table, you have to create a confining API in such a way that it really limits the developer's ability to get useful control over the table when they go to use it, or they have a completely leaky abstraction that doesn't actually add any value. And so to me, the right answer is to think very hard about the visual abstraction itself, just as hard as you'd think about the abstractions that you create for your like your backend database models and your backend logic, and think about it from that perspective. Like, would I add another layer to what I already have in my service call? Like, well, I've already got a service call that's abstracting the backend. I don't need another layer on top of that. Similar idea here to determine what's right is to, in my opinion, think about it as, is it the right language? Is it the right visual language or not? And then choose, once you have that down, whether or not an abstraction would help you actually migrate from one language to another. I've found it doesn't typically help.
Paul, how would I decide between kind of doing these, relatively advanced techniques? I think, using Sass in this way, making a library and so on to like do one of these contortions versus, just like kind of using CDK to build my own component that just, it's like maybe it's somewhat similar to one of the Angular Material components, but it's like, should I be trying to like somehow shove a date time picker into the date picker, or should I just start with kind of a clean sheet of paper, a clean empty directory, and build myself a date time picker? Like how would I choose between those?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different questions actually intertwined there. I want to talk about the date time picker thing in particular. What we had seen here at the end for some techniques to manage this was all about modifying kind of existing Angular material things as they sit, and it didn't really address the functionality gap issue. And for that functionality gap issue, like there's just no two ways around it. You have to make your own custom component or custom blocks of code to mesh those two things together, tie them together, and have the data flow in and out as a unit. There's just no way around that. The next question is, do we continue to use what's in the box with Angular material for its inner workings, or do we customize that as well? All of that is kind of one conversation. And then there's the other conversation of the CDK, which is to say, hey, when I do need to customize something from scratch and build something from scratch, what's the best way to do it? With the CDK, for those that aren't familiar, CDK comes from the Angular material space. It is the behavior and the logic associated with these controls that is agnostic of a design. So you have to bring the template, you have to bring the CSS, and then you can attach the actual like the behavior from the CDK to your custom template and design. And so that going down that route to me is pretty much akin to building your own design system from scratch or your own components from scratch, which sometimes you would have to do that in these situations, but it's not a suitable substitute for the idea of, hey, I've got a bunch of Angular material inputs out there and I just need to tweak a couple properties of it. There's actually a much bigger gap than you might imagine when you go all the way back down to saying, I'm going to do this from scratch. Because not only do you have to think about each of the properties that you're modifying, but then you have to think about all of Angular material that you're actually rebuilding from scratch. So for example, the animations, the transitions, the ability to have theming baked in, the accessibility aspects. You can tap into some of that with CDK, but there's still all that responsibility falls back on you. And so there's a lot of work in either path, and it's just a fine balancing act of picking when it's the right direction to drop down a level, build up on your own, or take what's there and fight to change the way that it looks just a little bit.
Do you have any tips or best practices working with design systems that are kind of based on material, or is that something that just because of the complexities of structure and styling, that design systems and Angular material don't really go well hand in hand?
I think it depends on, again, what your design system is. What's it trying to achieve? Are you trying to make a design system that is truly visually set apart from Angular material? If so, building on top of Angular material would be a terrible idea. You'd be spending all of your time fighting these kind of issues that I've brought up. And at the end of the day, you would still have a lot of the functionality brought to the table, but at a certain point, it just doesn't make sense to be customizing the look when there's the potential for such a large functionality gap. To me, I didn't address this in the main part of the conversation, but to me, a lot of the right answer for, like, do I build from scratch? Do I pause? Do I switch design systems? To me, the right answer is typically doing your best to understand and predict what direction the design language is going to go from the end user, and pick an existing design system whose implementation is most in alignment with whatever the client wants, and kind of meet them halfway. Be able to modify that library, that design system to meet their needs as best you can, and kind of split the difference on some of the items that don't actually line up. But again, not always able to do that. Sorry if that didn't answer your question or not. I don't know.
I think so, yeah. We were
Okay.
trying to do exactly that and run into those like structural issues. How do we like keep it maintained? Do we pollute in like style CSS all over overrides for our components because we can't have the overrides inside of a component?
Right.
We started with like buttons, which are easy, and
Yeah.
just made our life easier to be compliant to our design system, the way icons easier to appear. But then more complex components just start to like creep in a little bit. And like, what do? Do you base it off from CDK? Do you just leave it as it is with material and embrace material? But then the design might look a little bit nicer if we would just make certain modifications, but then you dig into like the code and try to like find either the templates or the CSS. So it's kind of deep rabbit holes that you go down.
Yep.
And we haven't found a good way to like deal with it.
Yeah, and that's at the heart of it. You were drawn in with the appeal of this quick, easy turnaround of features and functionality. You see the value in all of the subtle aspects of the design system functionality for things like modifying the just being able to modify the visual appearance of it, and being able to say, hey, I've still benefited from the accessibility, the animations, the themability, but starting with buttons, starting with inputs, you kind of like lie to yourself about how easy it is by accident. Like, oh, hey, this isn't too bad. But then you get to like the more complex things, you start getting custom templates, and you find out actually there's a huge structural gap here.
Very much can completely confirm.
Yeah, and unfortunately, like the answer is you're in for a long road of hard work, but that's just kind of that's just the reality of the situation, is that it's a lot of hard work to when your effort was aimed in one direction and you find out the target's here. Like, there is no good answer to that other than to like put in the work.
Thank you so much for your response. That was great.
Yep.
It seems like the only way around a lot of these issues is to get a design system first, because a lot of these issues are kind of like and like your design system and your components first before any app development's done, because we're all trying to figure out ways that we can future-proof some of this stuff and get going. But most of these ways require a lot of work.
Yeah,
a comment more than a question.
yeah, and I found this to be true well outside of Angular material. We've had a lot of clients that have come to us in the 11th hour of development where they say the application is like 85 to 90% done, but we need to change out the visual design of it. And we have to break the news to them that this is not going to be fun on your budget or your time and resources, and have to kind of gently walk them through the understanding of why this is actually surprisingly difficult. I think that's just the nature of the web platform right now, is that it is still at such a low level abstraction with the tools that we're using that visual layer is very baked into the other layers of the tier at this moment.
Seems like we might be out of questions, so maybe we should maybe wrap up the formal part here, and then we'll of course leave the room live here for as long as anybody wants to chat about anything else.